What would happen if the person being discriminated against on a flight turned out to be the very one buying the entire airline? Can a first-class ticket erase prejudice, or does it only expose the invisible line between belonging and being dismissed? That morning, Julian Carter, the head of Phoenix Aerotech, a multi-billion-dollar aerospace technology company, left his home in a neatly tailored, understated suit. He chose simplicity not to hide his status, but to be seen as just another human being, unadorned, not seeking admiration, only respect. At Atlanta International Airport, Julian entered the first-class area, where the check-in counters were laid with red carpet and bathed in soft, golden light, a silent reminder that this was a place meant for the privileged. But instead of a warm smile, he received a wary glance. Behind the counter stood Brenda, a middle-aged woman with bright red lipstick and a cold stare. She looked Julian up and down, then raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Julian smiled gently, not offended, and quietly placed his ticket and ID on the counter. Brenda scanned them, her expression freezing for a brief moment, before reluctantly printing his boarding pass. "First class, seat 1A, she said flatly, then turned away without a word of thanks. Julian picked up his suitcase and continued on without a word. But inside he knew this flight would be more than just a journey. That chill wasn't because of how he dressed, it was because his skin didn't fit the space he occupied. He was used to that, but never resigned to it. And perhaps this time, the very flight he was boarding would be the moment that ended that all-too-familiar pattern. No need for business cards, no need to raise his voice, just an unwavering look and a presence that could no longer be ignored. The boarding door slid open with a cold ding as Julian stepped into the first-class cabin alongside a stream of well-dressed passengers, most of them white businessmen accustomed to glossy leather seats and glasses of French wine poured before takeoff. No one paid him any attention. They didn't need to speak. Their glances had already crossed his name off the list of those deemed worthy of being here. A grey-haired man wearing Cartier glasses muttered as Julian walked past. "These days, it's easy to get a first-class ticket. Must be one of those reward programs." The comment was quiet, but just loud enough to draw chuckles from two others nearby. Julian didn't respond, only nodded slightly as if he hadn't heard. He'd heard it his whole life. His seat was 1A, right next to the front bulkhead, where passengers are served first and have an unobstructed view of the horizon. But as he lifted his luggage into the overhead bin, a woman approached. Her uniform was crisp, her name tag read Clarissa R., and her smile was paper-thin. "Excuse me, are you sure this is your seat?" The question wasn't just for confirmation. It was a test, to see if he had the confidence to claim his place, or if he'd quietly step aside, sensing he didn't belong. Julian simply held out his boarding pass in silence. Clarissa glanced at it, gave a slight shrug, then turned away with a barely audible murmur. "Interesting." There was no welcome, no customary glass of orange juice. Julian sat down, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but his mind couldn't shake the familiar feeling, the feeling of being an outsider in a space he had every right to claim. And what was even more painful was knowing this was only the beginning. Julian was flipping through the menu, but not out of hunger. His quiet habit of observation allowed him to notice every detail, the way Clarissa lingered longer at seats occupied by white passengers, the way champagne was poured for the man next to him even before he asked, and the way she breezed past seat 1A as if it didn't exist. He wasn't the only one who noticed. In seat 1B sat a woman in her mid-30s, dark brown hair tied neatly back, sharp eyes, and a phone that never left her hand. Ava Jennings, a journalist known for covering systemic injustice, was en route to New York to attend a media and equality summit. She said nothing, but her gaze tracked Clarissa's every move with razor-sharp focus. When the meal cart came around, Clarissa stopped at Julian's seat and said coldly, "We're sorry, your pre-ordered meal is unavailable. This is the replacement." A cold sandwich and a glass of water were placed in front of him, without a tablecloth, without silver cutlery, without a single word of proper apology. Julian looked directly at her. "I ordered steak. I have confirmation via email." Clarissa shrugged, her smirk edging toward mockery. The system might not have updated. Happens all the time. Ava turned her phone slightly, recording the exchange in a few swift seconds. She didn't need to ask why. With her experience, she had seen this kind of subtle discrimination masked in professionalism many times, but never this blatantly. Julian remained silent, but the feeling inside him was no longer anger. It was a storm gathering strength. Ava looked at him and asked softly, "Would you like me to be a witness?" Julian gave a slight smile. "Thank you, but I have my own way." Then he pulled out his phone and opened the recording app. The battle had begun, but no one yet knew that on this flight, a silent witness would be the one to shake the entire system. Clarissa returned to the first-class cabin with a glass of red wine on her tray, but it wasn't for Julian. She placed it in front of seat 1C, flashing a sweet smile at a white passenger who was still on the phone. Julian remained silent, his gaze fixed on the window. But inside, he was tracking Clarissa's every move through the secondary screen on his smartwatch. His personal assistant, Camille, had remotely connected to the flight's surveillance system. Every image inside the cabin was being instantly archived to Phoenix Aerotech's private server. He had developed this software for aviation safety monitoring. Today, it had become evidence. Ava glanced at Julian and whispered, "Who are you?" Julian didn't answer right away. He simply tilted his watch toward her, revealing the Phoenix emblem. Ava blinked. She recognized that symbol. Then, with a quiet breath of realization, she leaned back slightly and murmured, "You're the one acquiring this airline?" Julian nodded, so subtly only she could hear. "But I'm not flying today in that role." At that moment, Clarissa was speaking quietly to a male flight attendant near the galley. She adjusted her headset mic and muttered something about the guy in 1A, and just keep him quiet until we land. Ava looked at Julian and whispered, "She has no idea who she's dealing with." Julian gave a faint smile. "She doesn't need to. The issue isn't about me. It's about how they treat anyone who doesn't match the image they've decided belongs." Clarissa approached, this time with a stiff smile. "I apologize for the earlier inconvenience. Would you like to change your meal? We've just received a few more options." Julian shook his head. "I'm full. I'm only interested in the process." Clarissa stiffened. She sensed something slipping out of her control. And she was right. Because in the internal data, Camille was quietly collecting a string of past complaints from passengers of color, each reporting Clarissa's discriminatory conduct was beginning to resurface. The plane hadn't landed yet, but the mask had already fallen. The soft glow from the overhead cabin lights cast the first-class section in a facade of calm. But beneath that surface, everything was becoming more intense than ever. Julian sat still, yet beneath that quiet, layers of data were being transmitted in real time to Phoenix Aerotech's private server, through the very behavior monitoring software he had once developed to detect misconduct among flight crews. On the small screen of his smartwatch, video clips were being encrypted and time-stamped. Clarissa's mocking remarks, the denied meal, and most recently, her whispered instruction to a colleague, "Keep him quiet, just until we land." Ava, now no longer just a passing passenger, but a key witness, leaned in discreetly and asked, "Are you planning to go public?" Julian replied softly, "Not on this plane, but everything is being recorded. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been treated like this and had no proof." Meanwhile, down below in the aircraft's technical bay, an unusual signal caught the attention of Luke, a junior flight attendant recently assigned to this flight just a week ago. He had accidentally come across a system alert indicating an internal override, leading him to a name, Clarissa. A folder named Override Logs had just been created 15 minutes earlier, showing an order to remove the meal for passenger 1A and switch it to manual substitute. Luke knew it was wrong, but he wasn't sure how to act. However, when he returned to the upper cabin to refill water, he overheard Clarissa say, "If there's any issue, just say it was a system glitch. That's how we've always handled it." That was the moment something changed for Luke. He didn't know who the man in seat 1A was, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay silent like so many others had before. A few minutes later, inside the crew rest area, Luke quietly forwarded a full copy of the system logs to an anonymous email written on a small slip of paper someone had left in the personal storage drawer. Camille, phoenixintel.org, and just seconds later, Camille, 2,000 miles away at Phoenix's operations center, shot up from her chair. The game had shifted, and this time, those hiding behind a polished interface would be forced into the light. 1 hour before landing, a brief reconnection of the cabin network allowed Clarissa to check the passenger manifest on her internal device. Her intent was simple: to confirm the gnawing suspicion that the man in seat 1A was not just another passenger. And then, the name appeared on screen. Julian Carter, chairman of Phoenix Aerotech, the very company currently in the process of acquiring the airline. Clarissa froze. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had made it with the one person who held the future of the entire system she served in his hands. Instantly, she approached Julian, holding a tray with a fine glass of red wine, a white linen napkin, and the proper first-class entree. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for the earlier inconvenience. Please allow me to make this right on behalf of the crew." Julian didn't glance at the tray. He quietly folded his magazine, looked up, and replied in a calm, low voice that carried an icy precision. "You think a steak and a late smile can erase the way you saw me from the very start of this flight?" Clarissa stood frozen, her hands beginning to tremble. Around them, passengers started to take notice. Ava leaned toward Julian and whispered, "Word's already spreading. The hashtag #bread-is-not-service just went live." Julian gave a subtle nod. He knew Camille had begun the process of going public, but he didn't lift his chin with pride. No. He simply said, "I don't need redemption. I need to see the truth acknowledged." Clarissa opened her mouth to say something more, but the look in Julian's eyes made her step back. She had served thousands of flights, crossed paths with people from all walks of life, but never had she felt so small. Because for the first time, her uniform and self-assumed status offered no protection from the consequences. And as the cabin lights dimmed in preparation for landing, Clarissa understood. This was no longer just a flight. This was a test. And she had failed it before the plane ever left the ground. The plane touched down on the tarmac under the golden afternoon light of JFK Airport. But no one in first class truly felt like they had landed. The air seemed drained, every gaze fixed on the man in seat 1A, the one who had just brought an entire system to a stunned, belated realization. Clarissa no longer moved with ease. She stood near the galley, clutching the serving tray as if it could shield her from the growing wave of judgment around her. When the signal to unbuckle sounded, Julian didn't rush to rise. Instead, he picked up his phone and typed a short message. "Initiate Phase 2. Keep crew in position." 3 minutes later, at the front of the cabin, a woman appeared wearing a light grey blazer with the Phoenix Aerotech emblem pinned on the left side of her chest. Vanessa Lyles, Director of Security and Emergency Operations. She stepped forward without introduction, but her presence alone made it clear to the crew that this was no longer a routine flight. "Clarissa Raymond, Luke Delgado, Captain Briggs, you are requested to remain in the crew quarters. There is an internal summons." Clarissa turned pale. Captain Briggs emerged from the cockpit, visibly confused. "I have a connecting flight," he offered. Vanessa didn't raise her voice. "Not today." Ava followed behind Julian, phone still in hand. She whispered, "I'll be writing this report, but not as a journalist, as a witness." Julian gave a faint smile, though his eyes stayed on Clarissa. She stepped forward and nervously pressed a small piece of paper into his hand. "I didn't mean to. I was just doing what everyone's always done." Julian looked at the paper for a few seconds, then gently folded it and placed it on top of the cold meal tray she had once served him. "And that," he said, "is exactly why things have gotten this bad." The words weren't harsh. They were simply true. And truth, when spoken at the right moment, is something no one can deny. As Julian stepped off the plane, the press crowd instinctively parted. Not out of fear, but because they understood. This time, the story wasn't just another incident. It was the beginning of an industry-wide reckoning. A discreet conference room on the 22nd floor of the airline's headquarters, with soundproof walls and cold white lighting, had now become the place where 3 individuals, who once believed they were simply following protocol, had to face the consequences of their own indifference. Clarissa, Luke, and Captain Briggs sat on one hand of the long table. Across from them, Julian wore no suit, no name badge, yet every word he spoke carried the weight of an entire system about to be rewritten. "We're not here to talk about feelings. We're here to talk about data." Camille, Julian's executive assistant, stood beside him, remote in hand. The screen came to life with video footage. Clarissa's condescending glance as she checked a boarding pass, an audio clip of her saying, "Switch the meal to suit the passenger type," followed by a technical log showing she had deleted the original order and replaced it with the lowest tier substitute. Clarissa stared at the table, no longer able to offer any defense. I didn't think it would go this far," she whispered. "I was just following routine," Julian interjected, his voice firm but calm. "And that's exactly the problem. If our system has allowed these actions to become routine, then the system needs to be rebuilt." Captain Briggs remained silent, but when the recording played of him casually joking about a first-class black driver, he had nowhere left to hide. And then something unexpected happened. Luke stood up. He pulled out his phone and played a recording he had saved. It was a conversation between Clarissa and Briggs, 2 days before the flight. "This one's got a major shareholder on board. Heard he's black. Keep a close eye. If any of them are faking it, kick them off right away." The room fell completely silent. Not out of surprise, but because for the first time, the truth was being exposed from within. Julian gave a small nod. "Thank you, Luke." He turned to the head of HR. "Proceed with reassignment. 2 individuals. Terminate immediately. 1. Evaluate for retention and retraining for having the courage to speak up." No one objected, because this time, silence was no longer an excuse. Just 3 days after the investigation hearing, the entire structure of the airline, from internal protocols to public-facing communications, was placed under a new headline: Operation Reset 42. It wasn't a surface-level rebrand. It wasn't a scripted apology letter. It was a complete cultural overhaul, beginning in the very place that had long been treated as invisible. How crew members evaluate passengers, how staff look at a stranger's face and silently decide whether that person deserves first-class treatment. Julian did not appear in front of cameras. Instead, Ava Jennings, the journalist who had witnessed the events on that fateful flight, was invited to be the voice that delivered the truth. In a live broadcast titled "Bread is Not Service," she said, "Sometimes a cold slice of bread and a glass of water are not just carelessness. They are a message. And if we stay silent, we're saying that message is acceptable." The campaign introduced unprecedented measures in the industry: anonymous experience simulations from the perspective of people of color, real-time passenger feedback systems, and an independent unit tasked with auditing staff behavior based on standards of social equity. Clarissa and Briggs were terminated, but there was no celebration. Because this wasn't a personal victory, it was the first step in a much deeper promise. We will not allow prejudice to blur the quality of service. As for Luke, who had once only watched in silence, he was appointed Deputy Director of Behavioral Training. At his first press conference, he said, "There was a time I didn't dare to speak up. But the man in seat 1A made me realize, respect is not automatic. It must be protected." Public response exploded. The hashtag #BreadIsNotService surpassed 1 million shares in just 48 hours. More than just a reform, Julian had ignited a movement, a clear message to every organization. Kindness cannot be selective, and professionalism cannot be built on bias. A few weeks after the media storm had passed, Julian returned to the airport, not to manage a crisis, but to finally do something he hadn't been able to for a long time: fly as a regular passenger. No need to hide his identity. No need to prove anything. The first-class ticket still rested in the pocket of his coat, but it was no longer a pass for acceptance. It was a quiet statement that no one should be judged by how they look when stepping through a boarding gate. He sat once again in seat 1A, the same spot as before, but this time he was welcomed by a new flight attendant, Jenna, fresh from completing Phoenix's bias-free culture training program. She smiled genuinely, her eyes open and uncritical, her tone sincere. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter. Thank you for flying with us again. Would you like your signature meal? We've prepared it according to your last preferences." Julian nodded gently. Soon after, the tray arrived: roasted beef, crisp toast, a light red wine, and a delicate slice of chocolate mousse. But what satisfied Julian was not the food. It was the normalization of what should always have been right. No suspicious glances, no whispered mockery, no need for reputation or power to be treated with basic dignity. Ava, meanwhile, continued her own journey, her feature story, 36,000 feet beneath the mask of professionalism, won a National Journalism Award and was adopted into university curricula on media ethics. And Clarissa? No one heard much about her anymore. But in a closed-door seminar on professional conduct, her name was brought up as a case study of what must be remembered: so it is never repeated. Julian looked out the small window, watching wisps of cloud trail past the aircraft. He smiled, not because he had won, but because he knew he had just helped rewrite a standard. In aviation, they say the best flights are the ones no one remembers. But some flights, even if no one wished for them, leave the world changed forever. Not because they happened, but because everything after them could never be the same again. In the service industry, attitude is not just a skill, it is the very essence of a company's culture. Julian never needed power to be respected. What he needed was a system where every individual, no matter who they are, is recognized for their true worth. If you believe that fairness should never depend on appearance or titles, then like this video, subscribe to the channel to help spread stories that awaken the system, and leave a comment with the phrase, "Respect first," so together we can emphasize where doing the right thing should truly begin.